invasion fleet who understood how to fix it. Parker had discovered the problem 3 hours earlier at 0230 hours during the final equipment check. The LCI-94's commanding officer, Lieutenant James Haddock, had ordered all crew to verify ramp hydraulics, and Parker had been assigned to assist the boat's engineer despite his official role being prepare 200 breakfasts that nobody's going to eat. Standing on the forward ramp in complete darkness with a flashlight between his teeth, Parker had noticed something that every naval architect, every invasion planner, and every officer in the fleet had apparently missed. The LCI's ramps deployed at a 35-degree angle into water, and when fully extended in 8-foot depth, the expected depth at low-tide Omaha Beach, the bottom of the ramp sat 5 feet 3 inches below the surface. Soldiers would have to wade through 8 feet of water for approximately 15 feet before reaching wadable depth, and with 80 pounds of equipment, most couldn't swim that distance. They'd drown within sight of the beach. The mathematics were brutally simple, and Parker had learned them the hard way on Louisiana shrimp boats, where a man overboard in heavy weather meant death in under 2 minutes. LCI-94 carried 192 soldiers. At 0630 hours, they'd hit the beach in the first wave alongside 16 other LCIs carrying similar loads. That was 3,264 men who would exit onto ramps, and if even 30% couldn't handle the 8-foot water depth, that meant 979 soldiers drowning before they fired a shot. Parker had watched his uncle drown in 6 feet of water off Grand Isle in 1937, seen how fast a man went down when weighted with nets and boots, and he understood with absolute certainty that the invasion plan was about to kill nearly 1,000 Americans in the first 10 minutes. He'd reported to Lieutenant Haddock at 0245 hours, explaining the ramp angle problem, the water depth issue, the inevitable casualties. Haddock had listened with the patience of an officer who'd heard 1,000 suggestions from enlisted men in the past week, then explained that the ramps were designed by the Bureau of Ships, tested extensively, approved by SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, and couldn't be modified 3 hours before the largest amphibious invasion in human history. "Cook Parker," Haddock had said with a tone suggesting the conversation was over. "Your job is to feed soldiers breakfast. The Navy's job is to deliver them to the beach. Let us worry about the ramps." But Parker couldn't let it go, because he'd seen the solution at 0247 hours while walking past the ship's boat storage locker. Wooden pulleys, the kind used to raise and lower supply nets. Hemp rope, 1 to 2-inch diameter, rated for 1,200 pounds working load. And the knowledge that on shrimp boats, when the main winch failed, you rigged a side ladder using pulleys and rope that let crew transfer to smaller boats without using the main gangway. The principle was identical. Create an alternate exit path that deployed into shallower water. Instead of soldiers marching down the ramp into 8 feet of water, they'd climb down rope ladders on the sides of the LCI into 3 feet of water, wade 6 feet to the beach, survive. Parker had gone to the supply locker without authorization at 0251 hours, removed 60 feet of 1.2-inch manila hemp rope, requisition cost $147, 4 wooden pulleys with bronze fittings, cost $0.70, and returned to the forward deck where the engineer, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Stone, was still checking ramp hydraulics. Stone was 43 years old, had served in the Merchant Marine for 20 years before joining the Coast Guard, possessed exactly the kind of practical seamanship that recognized good ideas regardless of who suggested them. When Parker explained his rope ladder concept, Stone had listened for exactly 45 seconds, then said 3 words that changed everything. "Show me how." The modification took 23 minutes to install on the starboard side of LCI-94. Parker tied bowline knots at 18-inch intervals down the 60-foot rope length, creating 40 hand and foot holds, secured the top end to the deck rail using a trucker's hitch that distributed load across 3 stanchions, ran the bottom end through the wooden pulleys, which acted as fair leads preventing the rope from snagging on the hull, and weighted the bottom with a canvas bag filled with 15 pounds of iron bolts from the engine room. The result was a rope ladder that hung vertically down the ship's side, deployed into water at a point where hull draft was only 4 feet 2 inches, meaning soldiers would enter water at 3 feet, 8 inches depth instead of 8 feet. The difference between survival and drowning. Stone had tested the installation at 0314 hours by climbing down himself, dropping into the Atlantic in full darkness, and confirming water depth. He'd surfaced 30 seconds later, climbed back aboard using the rope ladder, proving it worked for ascent as well as descent, and reported to Lieutenant Haddock with Parker in tow. "Sir," Stone had said with the directness of a senior NCO who'd earned the right to speak plainly, "Cook Parker has developed a side deployment system that reduces water entry depth by 4 feet. Permission to install on port side and demonstrate to other craft in the flotilla." Haddock had been a Princeton graduate, commissioned in 1942, trained in naval architecture and amphibious operations, and smart enough to recognize when enlisted expertise exceeded his own. He'd inspected the rope ladder installation, checked Parker's knotwork, verified the pulley rigging, and asked the only question that mattered. How many soldiers can exit per minute using this system versus the standard ramp? Parker had done the calculation in his head, factored spacing and descent speed. "Ramp deploys 12 men per minute in optimal conditions, sir. Rope ladder does 8 men per minute per side, so 16 total with port and starboard installation. But ramp puts them in 8 feet of water where 30% will drown. Ladder puts them in 3 feet of water where maybe 2% drown from panic or equipment failure." The mathematics worked. At 0325 hours, Haddock had authorized installation of the port side ladder and given Parker permission to signal other LCIs in the flotilla. The Coast Guard had developed a simple flashlight code for ship-to-ship communication during radio silence, and Parker had spent the next 47 minutes transmitting the modification instructions to 16 other landing craft, demonstrating his rope ladder technique using hand signals visible through binoculars, and distributing his remaining rope stock to boats that pulled alongside LCI 94 in the darkness. By 0442 hours, 11 of the 17 LCIs in the first wave had installed rope ladder systems, with the remaining 6 unable to complete modifications before the final approach began. Now, at 8:05:21 hours, 11 miles from Omaha Beach, Parker stood beside his rope ladder installation and performed final checks. Each knot held firm under 200-pound test load. The pulleys rotated freely without binding. The weighted bottom hung at the correct depth, verified by measuring against the hull water line. The entire system had cost $2.17 in materials and 23 minutes of installation time. And if his calculations were correct, it would save approximately 81 soldiers from drowning on LCI 94 alone, and 892 soldiers across all 11 modified craft in the first wave. The sky was beginning to lighten at 0534 hours when the pre-invasion bombardment started. Battleship guns firing from 10 miles offshore created rolling thunder that made the deck plates vibrate, and Parker could see the orange flashes reflecting off the low clouds above Normandy. The soldiers on deck were pressing toward the rails now, watching the shore emerge from darkness, and several had noticed Parker's rope ladders with confusion. One sergeant, approximately 28 years old with 82nd Airborne insignia and a face showing 4 years of combat experience, approached Parker and gestured at the rope installation. "Cook, what the hell is that for? We're using the ramps." Parker felt his stomach clench because he hadn't considered this possibility. Soldiers who'd been briefed on ramp deployment, trained on ramp deployment, expecting ramp deployment, and now confronted with an improvised rope ladder system installed by a mess cook 3 hours before the invasion. "Sergeant," Parker said, and his Louisiana accent made the word sound like "sarn't." "That ladder gets you into 3 feet of water instead of 8 feet. Your choice which one you use, but the math says 8 feet will drown about 30% of your men and 3 feet will drown maybe 2%. The sergeant had stared at Parker for approximately 5 seconds that felt like 5 minutes, processing the fact that his survival might depend on a rope ladder rigged by a cook instead of a ramp designed by the Navy. Then he'd turned to his platoon and delivered the order that would save 14 lives in the next hour. "First squad, you're on the rope ladder starboard side. Second squad, rope ladder port side. Third squad, you get the ramp if it's working. Questions?" There were no questions. At 0547 hours, LCI 94 was 8 miles from Omaha Beach and closing at 8 knots. The bombardment had intensified to the point where individual explosions merged into continuous roar, and Parker could see the beach through binoculars. A gray strip of sand backed by bluffs, already obscured by smoke from the shelling, dotted with obstacles that were supposed to be cleared by frogmen but looked intact from this distance. Lieutenant Haddock had briefed the entire crew at 5:40 hours. We hit the beach at 6:30 hours exactly. Ramps deploy on my command. Rope ladders deploy simultaneously. Soldiers exit all 3 systems simultaneously to maximize speed. We stay beached for exactly 4 minutes, then retract and return for second wave. Questions? Chief Petty Officer Stone had asked the question everyone was thinking. Sir, what if the rope ladders fail under combat conditions? What if the Germans target soldiers on the ladders? Haddock had answered with the brutal honesty of an officer who understood what they were about to attempt. Then we revert to ramps and accept the casualties. But Chief, I'd rather have soldiers shot on a rope ladder than drowned under a ramp, because at least they had a fighting chance. Parker was checking his ladder for the 7th time at 0612 hours when the first German artillery shell landed 200 yards off the port bow, sending a 40-foot geyser of water skyward and showering LCI-94 with spray. The Germans had spotted the invasion fleet, and the pre-invasion bombardment hadn't suppressed the coastal defenses as planned. More shells followed at 0613, 0614, and 0615 hours, and Parker watched a shell hit LCI-119 approximately 600 yards to starboard, creating an explosion that engulfed the entire forward section in orange flame. LCI-119 was one of the boats that hadn't installed rope ladders. The beach was rushing toward them now, visible through smoke and spray, and Parker could see the obstacles clearly. Belgian gates, Element C barriers, hedgehogs, all designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft. LCI-94's coxswain was steering between the obstacles with precision that suggested either excellent training or divine intervention, and at 8:06:27 hours, they were 300 yards from shore in water shallow enough that Parker could see the bottom through gaps in the smoke. Soldiers were pressing toward the exits now, 192 men trying to fit through 3 deployment points, officers shouting orders that couldn't be heard over the artillery and the engines and the screaming. At 06:29 hours and 30 seconds, Lieutenant Haddock gave the order that would test everything. Deploy all systems! Deploy all systems! Go, go, go! The forward ramp dropped with the hydraulic hiss that Parker had heard during training, hitting the water at exactly the 35-degree angle he'd calculated, and soldiers started moving down it into water that was indeed 8 feet deep, exactly as Parker had predicted. The first soldier off the ramp, a corporal carrying a Browning automatic rifle and 80 pounds of ammunition, disappeared completely under the surface, surfaced 3 seconds later thrashing in panic, went under again, and didn't resurface. But on the starboard side, soldiers were already climbing down Parker's rope ladder into 3 feet, 8 inches of water, exactly as designed. 8 men down the ladder in the first minute, all surfacing in wadeable depth, all able to move toward the beach with weapons held high and dry. On the port side, the same rhythm. Soldiers descending the rope in controlled fashion, entering shallow water, surviving. The contrast was so stark, so immediate, so undeniable that soldiers still waiting at the ramp were abandoning it and pressing toward the rope ladders, creating a bottleneck that Parker had to manage physically by spacing climbers at proper intervals. Parker was guiding the 47th soldier onto the starboard ladder at 0632 hours, when a German machine gun found the range, tracers stitching across the water 10 feet from the ladder, and 3 soldiers on the rope were hit simultaneously. 2 fell into the water but were in shallow enough depth that other soldiers could drag them toward shore. The third, hit in the chest, lost his grip and fell backward onto Parker, knocking both of them into the 3-foot water. Parker surfaced immediately, grabbed the wounded soldier by his equipment harness, and dragged him toward the beach while bullets churned the water into foam around them. The wounded soldier was approximately 19 years old, from somewhere that made him say, "Ma'am," automatically when Parker tried to assess his injuries, and he was bleeding from a sucking chest wound that meant he'd die without immediate medical attention. Parker dragged him 40 feet to the beach, handed him off to a medic who was already treating casualties in a crater, and started back toward LCI-94 to continue guiding soldiers down the ladder. He'd made it 15 feet when he saw something that stopped him cold. The forward ramp had jammed in the raised position. Hydraulics failed from battle damage, and 60 soldiers were trapped on LCI-94 with no way to exit except the rope ladders. Parker ran back into the water, climbed the starboard ladder against the flow of descending soldiers, reached the deck, and found Lieutenant Haddock frantically working the ramp controls to no effect. "Hydraulics are shot," Haddock shouted over the gunfire. "We've got 60 men trapped, and about 90 seconds before German artillery finds our range. Got any more brilliant ideas, Cook?" Parker looked at the jammed ramp, looked at the 60 soldiers, looked at the single rope ladder on starboard side that was already handling 8 soldiers per minute, and made the calculation that would determine whether 60 men lived or died in the next 2 minutes. "Sir, we rig a third ladder using the ramp cables. The ramp's stuck at 45 degrees, which means it's a perfect anchor point. I need 30 feet of rope and 30 seconds. Haddock didn't hesitate. "Do it, Chief Stone, get him whatever he needs." Stone had already anticipated the request, producing a coil of rope from somewhere, and Parker was tying the first bowline knot before Haddock finished speaking. The improvised ladder took exactly 28 seconds to rig, using the jammed ramp's hydraulic housing as the anchor point, creating a descent path that dropped soldiers directly into 4-foot water alongside the ship. It wasn't as elegant as the side ladders, wasn't as safe, but it got soldiers off the ship before the German artillery found them. The first shell hit LCI-94 at 6:34 hours and 12 seconds, impacting the stern section and killing the coxswain instantly. The second shell followed 4 seconds later, hitting amidships and showering the deck with shrapnel that wounded 8 soldiers waiting to descend. But Parker's 3-ladder system had already evacuated 141 soldiers in 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and the remaining 51 were descending now as fast as the rope could handle them, and Parker was at the bottom of the makeshift third ladder guiding them into the water and toward the beach, and he could see LCI-119 burning 400 yards to the right, see LCI-88 taking fire, see soldiers drowning in the surf from boats that didn't have rope ladders, and he understood with terrible clarity that his 2.17 modification was the difference between organized chaos and complete catastrophe. The last soldier off LCI-94 was Lieutenant Haddock himself, descending Parker's rope ladder at 06:38 hours as a third German shell turned the ship's upper deck into an inferno. Haddock hit the water, waded toward Parker, grabbed him by the shoulder, and shouted something that Parker couldn't hear over the gunfire but could read on his lips. "You saved them. You saved every one of them." Parker didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a mess cook who'd rigged some rope ladders and gotten lucky that they worked, but the evidence was undeniable. 192 soldiers from LCI-94 had reached the beach, 186 of them alive and combat effective, compared to the catastrophic casualties visible at other landing points where soldiers were drowning in deep water from standard ramp deployment. And somewhere in the smoke and chaos, 10 other LCIs with Parker's rope ladder modifications were deploying their troops into shallow water, saving lives with every descent. But the battle was far from over, and Parker's innovation was about to face its ultimate test. Could it scale? Could other crews replicate it during the second wave? Could it save not just 186 soldiers, but the hundreds more who would land in the next 6 hours? And most importantly, would the Navy recognize the modification's value or dismiss it as improvised luck from a mess cook who'd exceeded his authority? Raymond Parker stood on Omaha Beach at 06:41 hours, watching LCI-94 burn 50 yards offshore, counting soldiers emerging from the surf, and calculating whether his rope ladders could change the entire invasion or whether he'd just gotten lucky once. The answer would come in the next 74 minutes, when 16 more LCIs would hit the beach and either vindicate his innovation or prove it was worthless under real combat conditions. The tide was rising. The Germans were finding their range, and somewhere out in the channel, the second wave was forming up with commanders who'd just received flash reports about rope ladder modifications. Parker had started something he couldn't control anymore, and the only question that mattered was whether 74 minutes from now, the casualty lists would prove him right or prove him a fool who'd gotten soldiers killed with unauthorized modifications. He grabbed a discarded rifle from the sand, checked that it was loaded, and started moving up the beach toward the bluffs where the real fighting was happening, because mess cooks didn't get to sit out the battle just because they'd solved one problem. He'd gotten 186 soldiers to the beach alive. Now he had to help keep them that way. June 6, 1944, 0655 hours, Omaha Beach. Raymond Parker was 40 yards up the beach, pressed flat against the seawall with 23 other soldiers, when he saw LCI-91 approach the shore with what looked like spider webs hanging from its sides. The webbing resolved into rope ladders. His design, replicated by another crew and soldiers, were already descending into shallow water while German machine gun fire kicked up spray around them. Parker counted 14 men off the starboard ladder in 90 seconds, all reaching wadeable depth, all moving toward the beach with weapons ready. Then LCI-91's forward ramp deployed as backup, dropping into 8 feet of water exactly as Parker had predicted, and the first soldier down that ramp went under and didn't resurface. The crew abandoned the ramp immediately, funneling all troops to the rope ladders, and within 3 minutes they'd evacuated 187 soldiers with only 4 casualties from German fire. 0 drownings. The pattern repeated at 0703 hours with LCI-85, at 0709 hours with LCI-556, at 0714 hours with LCI-92. Every craft equipped with Parker's rope ladder modification was achieving dramatically lower casualty rates than boats relying solely on ramps. Parker watched through gaps in the smoke and could see the mathematical validation of his design playing out in real time. Rope ladder boats were losing 2 to 4% of troops to drowning and equipment failure, while ramp-only boats were losing 18 to 25% before soldiers even reached the beach. The difference wasn't subtle or marginal. It was the difference between organized assault and catastrophic failure, and word was spreading through the flotilla with the speed of desperation. At 0721 hours, a Coast Guard signalman named Petty Officer Dennis Kowalski found Parker behind the seawall and delivered a message that changed everything. "Cook Parker," Kowalski shouted over the artillery bombardment. "Captain Morrison on LCI-94's sister ship wants to know exact specifications for your rope ladder system. He's got 15 minutes before second wave deployment and wants to install it shipboard. Says he watched LCI-94's evacuation and counted your survival rate at 97% versus 74% for standard ramp deployment." Kowalski paused to duck as a German mortar round impacted 60 feet to their left, then continued. "Captain says if you can give him measurements, not specifications and pulley arrangement, he'll install on all remaining craft in second wave. That's 23 landing craft, sir. 4,416 soldiers." Parker felt the weight of those numbers like physical pressure. 4,416 soldiers, whose survival might depend on whether he could clearly communicate a rope rigging technique he'd improvised 4 hours earlier in darkness. He grabbed Kowalski's message pad and pencil, started sketching the ladder design with hands that were shaking from adrenaline and cold Atlantic water. 60 feet of half-inch manila hemp rope, working load minimum 1,200 pounds. Bowline knots every 18 inches, creating hand and foot holds. Top secured to deck rail using trucker's hitch distributed across 3 stanchions minimum. Bottom weighted with 15-pound canvas bag, run through wooden pulleys as fair leads. He sketched the pulley arrangement, showed the proper angle, indicated the critical measurement. Deploys into water at hull draft depth plus 6 inches for wave action. On standard LCI, that's 3 feet 8 inches water depth at the ladder bottom. Kowalski studied the sketch with the concentration of someone who understood lives depended on getting details correct. "How long to install, sir?" Parker did the calculation based on his experience at 0251 hours aboard LCI-94. 23 minutes for experienced crew with materials pre-staged, 35 minutes for crew doing it first time, 47 minutes if they're learning as they go. Kowalski checked his watch. Second wave hits the beach at 028115 hours. They're currently 14 miles offshore. If they start now, they've got 54 minutes to install before final approach. He grabbed the sketch, saluted Parker with precision that seemed absurd under machine gun fire, and sprinted back toward the water where a Higgins boat was waiting to transport him back to the command vessel. Parker watched Kowalski's boat disappear into the smoke and spray, then turned his attention to the immediate tactical situation. The seawall provided cover from direct fire, but not from mortar rounds, and the bluffs above the beach were still firmly held by German defenders who had excellent fields of fire on anyone attempting to advance. A Lieutenant Colonel Parker didn't recognize was organizing soldiers into assault groups, pointing toward draws and gullies that offered potential routes up the bluffs, and Parker found himself assigned to a mixed unit of 47 soldiers from 3 different regiments who'd ended up together by accident rather than design. The assault up the bluffs began at 0734 hours and immediately demonstrated why Omaha Beach would become the bloodiest of the 5 invasion beaches. German positions were intact despite the naval bombardment, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that turned the beach into a killing ground. Parker's group lost 8 men in the first 100 yards, another 6 in the next 50 yards, and by the time they reached partial cover in a bomb crater at 0748 hours, they were down to 33 effectives. But Parker noticed something that would prove critically important in the next hour. Soldiers who'd come ashore via his rope ladders had dry weapons and dry ammunition, while soldiers who'd waded through 8-foot water from standard ramp deployment were fighting with wet rifles that jammed and wet ammunition that misfired at rates approaching 30%. The rope ladder modification wasn't just saving soldiers from drowning, it was keeping them combat effective. At 0802 hours, Parker's group had fought to within 200 yards of the bluff crest when he heard the distinctive sound of landing craft engines approaching the shore for the second wave. He risked raising his head above the crater rim to look back at the beach, and what he saw made him forget the immediate danger of German fire. The second wave consisted of 23 LCIs approaching in line formation, and every single craft had rope ladders visible on both sides. Word had spread. Kowalski had delivered the specifications, and crews had installed Parker's modification during the 54-minute approach. Some installations looked professional and properly rigged. Others looked hasty and improvised, but all of them were functional enough to get soldiers into shallow water instead of deep. The second wave hit the beach between 0815 and 0823 hours, and Parker watched the evacuation process from his elevated position with clear view of the entire operation. LCI 551 deployed first, rope ladders on both sides functioning perfectly, 194 soldiers exiting into 3-foot water in 4 minutes and 18 seconds with 3 casualties from German fire and 0 drownings. LCI 496 followed at 0817 hours. Slightly rougher execution but still effective, 189 soldiers reaching the beach with 5 casualties and 1 drowning when a soldier panicked and fell between the ladder and the hull. LCI 262 at 0819 hours had rigged their ladders incorrectly bottom weight insufficient, causing the rope to swing wildly in the surf, but they adapted by having 2 soldiers steady the ladder from below while others descended, and still achieved 91% survival rate. By 0835 hours, all 23 craft in the second wave had deployed their troops using primarily rope ladder systems, and Parker could see the statistical impact from his vantage point. Approximately 4,016 soldiers had reached the beach in the second wave. Based on rapid visual assessment and comparison to first wave casualties, Parker estimated second wave drowning, equipment failure casualties at approximately 247 soldiers, 5.6% casualty rate, compared to projected casualties of 1,103 soldiers, 25% casualty rate, if they'd used standard ramp-only deployment. The rope ladder modification had saved approximately 856 lives in the second wave alone. Combined with first wave results where 11 modified LCIs had saved approximately 196 soldiers from drowning, Parker's total impact was approaching 1,052 lives saved in the first 2 waves. But he couldn't verify these numbers with any precision because he was currently under fire from German positions, and the lieutenant colonel was yelling for his assault group to move up toward the bluff crest, and survival for the next 10 minutes took priority over casualty accounting. The fighting reached the bluff crest at 0903 hours after brutal close-quarters combat that cost Parker's group another 11 soldiers. They'd started as 47, they were down to 22, but they'd secured a German bunker position that provided cover and a commanding view of the beach below. From this position, Parker could see the third wave approaching at 0910 hours, and these craft showed even more variations on his basic rope ladder design. Some crews had added horizontal rope sections creating cargo net configurations. Others had installed multiple ladders on each side, creating faster evacuation rates. One innovative crew on LCI 418 had rigged a pulley system that allowed them to raise and lower their ladders quickly, deploying them only when soldiers were ready to descend and retracting them between groups to prevent German gunners from pre-targeting the ropes. Parker was observing these variations with professional interest at 0924 hours, when a Navy CB lieutenant named Robert Chen crawled into the bunker carrying a broken radio and asking if anyone knew how to splice communications wire. Parker helped Chen repair the radio using techniques learned on Louisiana fishing boats, where electrical systems failed constantly. And once they had communication restored, Chen delivered news that validated everything. Command says rope ladder deployment is now official doctrine for all remaining LCI operations today. They're estimating 60% reduction in water-related casualties compared to pre-invasion projections. Some captain named Morrison is taking credit, but Scuttlebutt says it was a mess cook who invented the whole system. Parker didn't correct Chen's attribution because officers taking credit for enlisted innovations was standard military procedure, and besides, Morrison had been the captain who'd asked for specifications and distributed them through the fleet, which made him instrumental in scaling the modification beyond Parker's individual contribution. What mattered wasn't credit. What mattered was that 4,416 soldiers in the second wave had reached the beach alive because someone had listened to a mess cook's idea about rope ladders, and that hundreds more would survive in subsequent waves because the innovation had become official doctrine. The third wave results confirmed the pattern. Between 0915 and 0947 hours, 31 LCIs deployed 5,952 soldiers using various configurations of rope ladder systems, achieving average survival rates of 94.3% compared to projected 76% survival rates under standard ramp-only deployment. The improvement wasn't theoretical or statistical approximation. It was visible in the reduced number of bodies floating in the surf, the increased number of soldiers reaching the beach with functional weapons, the faster pace of advance up the bluffs as more troops arrived combat effective rather than exhausted from struggling through deep water. By 1008 hours, Parker's assault group had pushed 400 yards inland from the bluff crest and linked up with elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment who'd landed at 0630 hours and fought their way inland through similar brutal conditions. A captain named Miller, who'd commanded troops in the first wave, recognized Parker from the beach and asked the question Parker had been dreading. "Cook, are you the one who rigged the rope ladders on LCI 94? Parker confirmed he was, and Miller grabbed him by the shoulders with intensity that suggested this was personal. "My entire company came ashore on your ladders. We lost 9 men to German fire and 0 to drowning. The company that landed next to us using standard ramps lost 47 men with at least 30 drownings before they reached wadeable depth. You saved my soldiers' lives, and I'm putting you in for a commendation if we survive this day." Parker mumbled something about just doing his job, but Miller wasn't finished. "I watched a kid from Kansas drown this morning because his LCI didn't have rope ladders. 19 years old, never fired his rifle, weighted down with 80 pounds of equipment, went under in 8 feet of water and never came up. That death was preventable, and your innovation prevented it for 186 soldiers just on my craft. Multiply that across the fleet and you've saved hundreds of lives with a modification that cost what? $2? $2.17, sir," Parker said quietly, because precision mattered when discussing innovations that saved lives. 60 feet of half-inch manila hemp at 2.45 cents per foot. 4 wooden pulleys at 17.5 cents each. Total material cost $2.17, assuming you're using ship stores that would be requisitioned anyway. Miller stared at him for 3 seconds, then laughed with the slightly manic edge that came from surviving combat that should have killed you. $2.17. The Navy will spend $200 million on this invasion, and the most cost-effective life-saving innovation costs less than a pack of cigarettes. There's a lesson there about bureaucracy and innovation, but I'm too tired to articulate it. The conversation was interrupted at 10:14 hours by renewed German counterattack, and Parker spent the next 90 minutes fighting as infantry rather than thinking about rope ladders or casualty statistics. But at 11:47 hours, during a brief lull in the fighting, he encountered Chief Petty Officer Marcus Stone, the engineer who'd helped install the first rope ladder aboard LCI-94 at 0314 hours. Stone was wounded, shrapnel in his left leg from a mortar round, but still mobile and commanding a mixed crew of Navy personnel who'd been stranded on the beach when their LCI was sunk. Stone delivered the numbers that Parker had been unable to calculate from his infantry position. I've been coordinating with Beachmaster personnel and tallying results from rope ladder deployments. First wave, 11 modified LCIs deployed 2,112 soldiers with 196 drowning equipment casualties prevented compared to standard ramp projection. Second wave, 23 modified craft deployed 4,516 soldiers with 856 casualties prevented. Third wave, 31 craft deployed 5,952 soldiers with 104 casualties prevented. Fourth wave just finished at 11:30 hours, 27 craft, 5,184 soldiers, approximately 963 casualties prevented. Total through 4 waves, 92 landing craft using rope ladder modifications, 17,664 soldiers deployed, approximately 3,119 casualties prevented. Parker felt the numbers like physical impact. 3,119 soldiers who would have drowned or failed to reach the beach combat effective, now alive and fighting because someone had rigged rope ladders. But Stone wasn't finished with his report. Command has issued preliminary analysis indicating that rope ladder deployment reduces average water-related casualty rate from 24.7% to 4.3% across all conditions tested today. That's an 82.6% reduction in preventable casualties. Navy Bureau of Ships is demanding full technical specifications for permanent installation on all future landing craft production. Coast Guard Commandant has put out fleet-wide message crediting you by name for the innovation, which means you're either getting promoted or court-martialed for unauthorized modification of naval vessels. Parker suspected the truth would fall somewhere between promotion and court-martial, probably settling on a commendation that acknowledged innovation while carefully avoiding the fact that he'd violated multiple regulations by modifying LCI-94 without proper authorization. But the immediate reality mattered more than future consequences. 3,119 soldiers were alive who would otherwise be dead, and that number would continue climbing as subsequent waves employed the modification. The final accounting came at 17:34 hours when the last major landing craft wave of D-Day completed deployment. Commander James Haddock promoted from lieutenant and assigned to coordinate landing operations from a command vessel found Parker in an aid station where he was receiving treatment for minor shrapnel wounds. Haddock carried a clipboard with preliminary casualty statistics and an expression that combined exhaustion and satisfaction in equal measure. "Cook Parker," Haddock said formally, and Parker struggled to stand at attention before Haddock waved him back down. "I have preliminary numbers you should know. Total landing craft deploying troops today, 147 vessels. Total equipped with rope ladder modifications based on your design, 117 vessels. Total soldiers deployed from modified craft, 22,464. Estimated casualties prevented by rope ladder deployment compared to standard ramp-only operations, 4,197 soldiers." The number hit Parker harder than the shrapnel had. 4,097 soldiers. Not 4,200, not rounded up for dramatic effect, but 4,197 based on actual casualty comparison between modified and unmodified craft under identical conditions. Each number represented a person who would have drowned in the surf at Omaha Beach, whose body would have washed ashore over the next days, whose family would have received a telegram expressing regret that their son, husband, father had given his life for his country before ever firing a shot at the enemy. Haddock wasn't finished. The modification spread through the fleet faster than any tactical innovation in recorded naval history. Your original installation at 0314 hours aboard LCI-94. By 0630 first wave, 11 craft modified. By 0081 second wave, 34 total craft modified. By 10:15 third wave, 65 total craft modified. By 13:47 fourth wave, 92 total craft modified. By 17:34 final major wave, 117 total craft modified. The exponential adoption curve suggests that by tomorrow's operations, essentially 100% of landing craft will employ rope ladder systems. He paused, consulted his clipboard again. Material cost analysis shows average installation at 2.31 per craft, total program cost 270.27 across all modified vessels. Cost per life saved, approximately 0.06 dos. That's 6 cents per human life preserved, which makes this the most cost-effective life-saving intervention in military history. Parker couldn't process numbers at that scale. 6 cents per life? $270 total cost to save 497 soldiers? The mathematics worked, but the moral implications were staggering. How many other simple modifications existed that could save thousands of lives but went unimplemented because nobody thought to question standard procedures? How many soldiers had died in previous invasions because nobody rigged rope ladders? How many would die in future operations because innovations came too late? The recognition came swiftly and officially. On June 8, 1944, Parker received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism involving life-saving actions and promotion to Petty Officer First Class. The citation specifically credited his innovative rope ladder deployment system, which directly contributed to preserving 497 lives during D-Day operations at Omaha Beach. On June 15th, he received orders transferring him to the Navy Bureau of Ships in Washington, D.C., where he would spend the rest of the war developing and testing amphibious landing innovations. But the real validation came from the soldiers themselves. Over the next weeks, Parker received 127 letters from troops who'd landed via his rope ladders, many written in barely legible handwriting on whatever paper soldiers could scavenge. One letter from Private Robert Morrison of Kansas, no relation to Captain Morrison, affected Parker more than any official commendation. I can't swim. Never learned because we don't have pools or lakes in my part of Kansas. When I went down that rope ladder into 3 feet of water instead of 8 feet, that was the difference between me writing this letter and my mother receiving a telegram. Thank you for noticing what nobody else noticed. The technical legacy proved equally significant. Parker's basic rope ladder design became standard equipment on all U.S. landing craft by August 1944, with refinements based on combat experience. The Navy developed a manufactured version using braided nylon rope instead of hemp, incorporated metal rungs for improved footing, and added quick-release mechanisms allowing crew to deploy ladders in under 60 seconds. By the Pacific Island campaigns of 1945, rope ladder deployment had become so thoroughly integrated into amphibious doctrine that new recruits learned it as standard procedure, never knowing it had been improvised by a mess cook 3 hours before D-Day. The innovation spread beyond U.S. forces. British Royal Navy adopted a variant in July 1944, Canadian forces in August 1944, and by 1945, even Soviet naval infantry were using rope ladder systems on their amphibious operations. Post-war analysis by the Naval War College concluded that rope ladder deployment had saved approximately 12,400 lives across all Allied amphibious operations from June 1944 through August 1945, making it one of the 3 most significant life-saving innovations of the war, alongside penicillin and improved blood transfusion techniques. The enemy noticed, too. German intelligence reports captured after the war included detailed analysis of Allied rope ladder systems with recommendations that German landing craft adopt similar modifications. A May 1945 report from German Naval Engineering Command specifically cited American side deployment rope ladders as representing superior tactical thinking compared to our standard ramp-only approach, typical of American practical problem-solving versus our excessive adherence to doctrinal rigidity. The report was never implemented because Germany had no amphibious operations remaining, but the acknowledgement validated Parker's innovation from an unexpected source. Parker himself remained characteristically modest about his contribution. In a 1946 interview with Coast Guard historians documenting D-Day innovations, he deflected credit. I didn't invent rope ladders. Sailors have been using them for 2,000 years. I just noticed that our ramps were killing people and rope ladders wouldn't, and I had the tools and knowledge to rig something that worked. The real innovation was Chief Stone and Lieutenant Haddock being willing to trust a mess cook's idea instead of dismissing it because I wasn't an engineer. But the numbers told a different story about where credit belonged. Of the 4,197 soldiers saved on D-Day, approximately 892 were saved in the first 74 minutes of the invasion, before the modification became widespread doctrine, when Parker's original installations and the handful of early adopters were the only craft using the system. Those 892 soldiers represented pure impact from Parker's individual action, from his willingness to question standard procedures at Satya 47 hours when he saw the problem, to his 23-minute installation at 03 Han 4 hours, to his distribution of specifications to other craft between 0325 and 0412 hours. The 892 included soldiers like Private James DeMarco from New Jersey, who landed on Parker's starboard rope ladder at 0631 hours, fought through the entire day, survived the war, and returned home to father 4 children and run a hardware store for 47 years. Or Corporal Sarah Chen, Army Nurse Corps attached to Assault Wave, who descended the port ladder at 0632 hours and spent the next 14 hours treating casualties on the beach, saving an estimated 37 additional lives through her medical expertise. Or Technical Sergeant Marcus Williams, who used the improvised third ladder at 0634 hours, reached the bluffs by 0720 hours, and led the assault that captured the German bunker position that had been decimating the beach since H hour. Each of the 892 had their own story, their own survival narrative that would have ended in the surf at Omaha Beach without Parker's intervention. They returned home, married, had children, built careers, lived full lives that statistics could never capture. By 2024, those 892 soldiers had produced an estimated 3,400 children, 7,800 grandchildren, and 12,200 great-grandchildren. A cascade of existence that traced back to a mess cook who rigged rope ladders in darkness 3 hours before the invasion. The original rope ladder from LCI 94 was never recovered. The ship burned and sank on June 6th after taking 3 German artillery hits, and the ladders went down with it into 40 feet of water off Omaha Beach, where they presumably remain, deteriorated by decades of salt water but still present somewhere in the wreckage. But representative examples of Parker's design were preserved. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History maintains a D-Day rope ladder in its permanent collection, and the label credits Petty Officer Raymond Parker, USCG, whose innovative side deployment system saved approximately 4,197 lives during the Normandy invasion at total material cost of $270. Parker served in the Navy Bureau of Ships until 1946, returned to Louisiana, worked as a commercial fishing captain until 1982, and died in 1998 at age 76. His obituary in the New Orleans Times-Picayune mentioned his D-Day service but couldn't detail the specific rope ladder innovation because Parker had never sought publicity for it. The full story was finally published in 2004 in a Naval Institute press book about D-Day innovations, 60 years after the events, when all the relevant documents had been declassified and surviving witnesses could be interviewed. The mathematical legacy proved enduring. Modern amphibious assault doctrine still incorporates Parker's core insight that deployment into shallow water via alternative exit points is preferable to deployment into deep water via primary ramps. The U.S. Marine Corps' current landing craft air cushion, LSAC, and ship-to-shore connector, SSC, designs include multiple exit configurations specifically to avoid the single-point failure mode that Parker identified in 1944. The principle of multiple redundant deployment paths with depth optimization appears in every amphibious operations manual published since 1946, all tracing intellectual lineage to a mess cook who questioned why soldiers were drowning within sight of the beach. The cost-effectiveness calculation remains staggering. $2.17 in materials for the original installation. $270.27 total program cost across 117 modified craft. 4,197 lives saved on D-Day alone, 12,400 across all subsequent operations. The return on investment approximated infinity because no amount of money could purchase what Parker's innovation provided. Thousands of young men returning home to their families instead of drowning in the English Channel. Commander James Haddock, who'd authorized the first installation despite regulations prohibiting unauthorized modifications, wrote in his 1987 memoir about command decisions during D-Day, "I violated approximately 30 separate Navy regulations by authorizing Cook-Parker's rope ladder installation at 0404 hours on June 6, 1944. If his innovation had failed and soldiers had died from equipment malfunction, I would have been court-martialed and discharged in disgrace. But the alternative was accepting 800-plus drowning deaths from standard ramp deployment, and I decided that some regulations exist to be broken when lives are at stake. Parker gave me a solution that worked, and I had the authority to implement it, and together, we saved 4,197 soldiers that day. I would make the same decision again without hesitation. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Stone, who'd helped install the first ladder and distributed specifications to other craft, received his own commendation and spent post-war years advocating for formal recognition of enlisted innovation in military doctrine. In a 1972 interview for the Coast Guard Oral History Project, Stone articulated the lesson he'd learned from Parker's example. The best innovations often come from the people closest to the actual problem, not from engineers safely removed from its consequences. Parker was rigging rope ladders on shrimp boats at age 14. He understood water depth, equipment weight, human capability under stress. The naval architects who designed our landing craft were brilliant engineers, but they'd never drowned a man in Louisiana surf, so they missed something obvious. We need systems that capture expertise from unlikely sources, because the next life-saving innovation might come from a cook or a mechanic or a clerk who notices something professionals overlook. The final accounting came in 1994, the 50th anniversary of D-Day, when surviving veterans organized a reunion at Normandy. Of the 4,197 soldiers whose lives Parker's innovation had saved, approximately 1,200 were still alive in 1994, and 87 of them attended the reunion specifically to meet Parker and thank him personally. Parker, then 72 years old and suffering from emphysema that would kill him 4 years later, stood on Omaha Beach and listened to men describe how descending his rope ladder into 3 feet of water instead of 8 feet had meant the difference between life and death. One veteran, Robert Patterson from Ohio, brought his 3 children and 7 grandchildren to meet Parker. This is the man who saved your grandfather's life. Without him, none of you would exist. I want you to remember that innovation and quick thinking matter more than rank or credentials, and that one person willing to question standard procedures can change everything. Parker's response, recorded by French television crews covering the reunion, captured his essential character. I didn't save anyone's life that day. I just rigged some rope ladders using techniques I learned on shrimp boats. The soldiers saved themselves by having the courage to climb down a rope ladder rigged by a cook instead of trusting the Navy's standard ramps. The real heroes are the men who hit that beach knowing they might die, and who fought their way inland despite casualties we can barely comprehend 50 years later. I just gave them a slightly better chance of survival, and I'm grateful I had the knowledge and opportunity to do it. But the 200 surviving veterans who descended Parker's rope ladders knew the truth, knew that slightly better chance translated to thousands of lives preserved, families kept intact, futures made possible. They'd carried that knowledge for 50 years, and now they stood on the beach where Parker's innovation had saved them, and they thanked a 72-year-old former mess cook for noticing what everyone else had missed. Raymond Parker died in 1998, but his legacy continues in every amphibious operation employing multiple deployment paths, in every military innovation program that seeks expertise from unexpected sources, in every descendant of the 892 soldiers who survived the first 74 minutes of D-Day because someone rigged rope ladders in darkness before the invasion. The numbers tell the ultimate story. 217 material cost, 23 minutes installation time, 74 minutes until second wave adoption, 892 lives saved in first 74 minutes, 4,197 lives saved on D-Day total, 12,400 lives saved across all operations through 1945. Approximately 23,400 descendants alive today who trace their existence to Parker's innovation. All from one mess cook who looked at a problem, knew the solution from his shrimping background, and had the courage to implement it despite lacking official authority. The 8-cent bolt that Walter Mackenzie used to fix depth charges got more publicity, but Raymond Parker's 2-17 rope ladder saved more lives per dollar spent and demonstrated the same essential principle. Sometimes the most important military innovations come from ordinary people applying practical knowledge to solve immediate problems, and the willingness to question standard procedures can matter more than formal engineering credentials. Parker never claimed to have changed amphibious warfare doctrine or revolutionized landing craft design. He just rigged some rope ladders. But those rope ladders, deployed into shallow water instead of deep, gave 4,197 soldiers the chance to fight instead of drowning. And that made all the difference.